Good morning, everybody. How you guys doing today? You doing good? You're looking good. My name is Mike Howard. I'm one of the pastors here at Revision, and I'm pumped to be with you today as we finish up this Manger Things Christmas series that we've been in for the last month. One of the things I love about that video we just watched and the hymn that played underneath it, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus, is that it reminds us that Christmas really isn't the beginning of the story. We tend to think of births as like new beginnings, and it's easy, at least for me, to think about Christmas as being kind of the beginning of the life and story of Jesus. But the reality is that Christmas isn't the beginning or the end. It's this phenomenal crescendo smack dab in the middle of the human story that completely rerouted the direction of the future. I think it's impossible from our vantage point a couple millennia later not to look back and realize that there's something magical and amazing and wonderful and supernatural about that. That's kind of what this series has been about, the very real and tangible ways in which the supernatural realities of Christmas can transform our lives in this broken world. And for those of you who may be here for the first time this morning, Manger Things is kind of a play on the show Stranger Things, because one of our core values at Revision is rhyming. It's not, we're just really good at it. But in the show Stranger Things, there's these supernatural forces from an alternate dimension called the Upside Down that affect the lives of these people in a small town in Indiana. And we've been talking for a month about how that's a really cool picture of Christmas. Because Christmas is a supernatural God stepping out of eternity into our story to turn the entire world upside down. And he brought with him hope and truth and joy. Those are manger things that are accessible to every single one of us because Jesus came. And what I want to do this morning is close this series by looking at one more manger thing that we can find by taking a look at a Christmas story in the Bible that isn't quite as familiar for most of us as the one that's written in Luke 2 that we read last week. There are four biographies of the life of Jesus in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if you grew up in or around the church at all, the Christmas stories that you've heard come from those books, namely the perspective of Matthew and the perspective of Luke. And you've probably heard those two stories mashed together a whole lot. Because Mark's a man of action. He has no time. Babies just lay there and they poop and they cry and they're boring. I've had 4 of them. I'm with him. So he just is like, I'm skipping that whole part. I'm starting right when Jesus did crazy miracles. And John is a different cat altogether. He's a really artful and philosophical writer. And a lot of people believe that his contribution to the Christmas story is John chapter 1. Where he writes that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and through the Word all things were made that have been made, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But that's not entirely accurate. That's part of John's contribution, but later in his life, John actually wrote down an account of what happened at the manger as well. He just happened to write it from a God's eye view rather than a human view. And he wrote it as a tale of a boy and a dragon. And I think it's an incredibly powerful and important story to dig into this Christmas because of the very real dragons every one of us is facing in our lives. We all have things that feel big and scary and threatening, that haunt our dreams and stand between us and the lives God says we were made for. And for me, right now, one of the biggest dragons in my life is 2 4-year-olds who just do not care about being naked anywhere at any time. Yesterday, Billy decided that he was going to get dressed in our living room, even though we had a whole bunch of neighbor kids over to play, and I leaned in and told him, Billy, no one wants to see your butt. And he looked at me dead serious and said, oh, I should turn around. So much worse. So much worse. What do you do with that as a parent? I don't know. I'm dealing with this. And we're all dealing with small inconveniences like that, but I think a whole lot of us got big dragons in our lives as well. Some of us are staring down sickness or suffering from feelings of insignificance. We're dealing with loss or crushed by loneliness. We feel afraid of the future, fried by our finances or forgotten by our friends. We're sick of the social pressures of school and society. We're just beaten up by busted relationships and broken promises. Whatever the dragons are in your life, we've all got them. That's actually kind of part of what it is to be human in this world. It's fascinating on an anthropological level, but dragons exist in the folklore and the imagination of almost every culture across the history of the world. Even though we're separated by time and space and language and tradition and history, one of the things that ties all of humanity together is this common fear of the mythical beast that is part snake, part lion, and part eagle. Like all of our greatest fears rolled into one, and then breathing fire just for fun, the wonderful cherry on top. I'd be willing to bet that there are a whole lot of us in here and a whole lot of people around our world too who would love to go back to the days when we were little kids and imaginary creatures were our greatest source of fear and anxiety. Like we'd trade our real world problems for fairy tale problems any day of the week. But there are some lessons that we can learn from fairy tales and from John's story of the boy and the dragon. Actually, lessons that a lot of us learned a long time ago when we were young, but too many of us have forgotten. One of my favorite authors in the world is this British Catholic guy who lived at the turn of the 20th century. His name is G.K. Chesterton. And he once wrote this: "Fairy tales do not tell children the dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children the dragons can be killed." I think so many of us and so many of the people our lives crash into every single day are living defeated and afraid, defining ourselves by the wounds and the scars of our past, held back by our fears and our worries, feeling hopeless and helpless like we were beat when we were born. What happens is we grow up and we start to call our dragons by different names, and then we come to believe that they can no longer be slain. But what I want to tell you this morning is that because Jesus came, they can. I want us to walk out of here knowing that victory is a manger thing. If you have a Bible with you, you can open it up to Revelation chapter 12. It's way, way, way in the back. If you don't have one, you can queue it up in the Revision app or just follow along on the screen. And if you don't own one, we got a bunch of them in adult and kids versions, a bunch of different colors at the Next Steps table. We would love to give you one today. Please take one home with you. But Revelation, this is John, the same guy that wrote the Gospel of John, writing a letter to some churches that were under very intense persecution for their faith, about this vision God gave him of the end of the world. And John's purpose in writing this letter is to fire them up and encourage them that even though things are difficult, even though the situation looks hopeless, the end of the story has already been written. God has it sealed, so they don't need to lose hope and they can persevere. And if you sat down and just cracked it open and read Revelation without any context, you would think, that is not what I'm getting out of this book at all. This is weird and crazy. And you wouldn't be wrong. But the truth is, it's way less intimidating than that. The secret to Revelation is just a lot of powerful and symbolic imagery that John uses to paint a bigger picture of what's actually going on in the world on a supernatural, spiritual level. And Revelation 12 paints a bigger picture of what was really going on that first Christmas. Because what happened that night in Bethlehem was a whole lot bigger than the things that human eyes perceived. This is John telling us that all we see is not all there is. Here's how John tells the Christmas story. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. That's a little bit of a different Christmas story than the one we're used to. We don't sing songs about that one. We like to sing songs and Christmas carols where the animals are cute, like the cattle are lowing, whatever lowing even is. I don't even know. Or we like to sing the ox and lamb kept time. And we even changed that one to make it cuter. The original lyrics happened to be out of the prophecy about Jesus in Isaiah 1, but an ox and a donkey were present then, and the one-syllable word for donkey is Christian cussing, so we can't say that anymore. So we're just like, I don't know about that foul-mouthed Isaiah, but I'm singing lamb, okay? But I've never, ever in my life heard anyone sing, the dragon snarled at him, pa-rum-pa-pum-pum. I've also never seen a nativity that looks like this until I made it in my house. I put Hook Fang up there, and I'm keeping him. It's cool. But maybe, our nativities ought to look a little bit more like that and a little bit less like the precious scenes that we see, because Christmas was so much bigger than a cute, quiet little night. And this passage helps us see that. It helps us understand the enormity of what happened on a cosmic scale. And it basically walks us through all of salvation history. This is the story of humanity in 17 verses. And what I want to do this morning is unpack it a little bit so we can get a little bit better understanding of the weird thing that we just read, and then talk about some of the implications, like what it means for us that John is declaring that victory is a manger thing. So first things first, there are kind of two levels of the story happening in this passage. There's the obvious surface level, a poetic and visually stunning picture of Mary giving birth to Jesus with the powerful and vicious enemy of God and mankind, the devil, standing there attempting to devour the baby from the start. And we see the consequences of what it looked like that Satan tried to snuff out this life in the murder of the innocents. King Herod was the ruler over Judea, and he killed every male child in that region under the age of 2, because some magi appeared and said, 2 years ago this star appeared, a king is born, and Herod tried to snuff them out. That's what it looked like, but God had appeared to Joseph in a dream, and Joseph, Mary, and Jesus were whisked away to the wilderness of Egypt, where they were kept safe for a time. Like that's the surface level of what's happening, but this story is actually way bigger than that. It's the story of God and us from the beginning of time. The pregnant woman represents God's people, groaning and waiting and anticipating, like a pregnant woman, the day when finally the Messiah would be born. Just waiting from the very moment that the world got shattered by sin, when humanity turned its back on God, longing for the one God promised to come and set things right. That's what this woman represents. It's the people of God. And then Christmas happened. Eternity crashed into history, and light exploded into darkness, and Jesus stepped into the world and took on human flesh. And the reference that John makes in Revelation 12 to this baby being the one who would rule with an iron scepter is a reminder that in that same prophecy, his name will be the Prince of Peace. And the seven-headed blood-red dragon is the prince of darkness, the mortal enemy of the Prince of Peace, the devil, Satan, the fallen angel who wanted God's throne and whose mission is to lie, kill, and destroy human beings, to rob people of the future and the eternity God says we were made for. And the enemy did all that he could to kill Jesus, to stop him from this mission from beginning to end, and for a minute he thought he won. But it was a terrible mistake, because Jesus wasn't going to stay dead, and he defeated death from the inside, and he rose again, and he accomplished the resurrection, or the reconciliation of God and humanity through his resurrection, which sealed the devil's fate. Satan is the loser. He's already lost, and he's enraged about it to the point of persecuting God's people and fighting to keep the world in darkness, because he knows the end is near and the result is determined. But despite the fact that the devil is doing all he can to further shatter an already shattered world, God has not abandoned his people, and he never will. That's Revelation 12. That's what this passage is saying. That's what it's all about. And this message that there is more going on in our world than just the things that we see is one that's echoed throughout the entire Bible. In his letter to the church at Ephesus, Paul reminds us that our struggle, our fight, all the brokenness that we experience in this world, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And look, this doesn't mean that the devil is hiding behind every bush or underneath every rock, but we have a very real spiritual enemy who wants to destroy our lives, crush our hope, and rob our eternity. And right up until the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, he was locked into a grand cosmic battle with God for the souls and the future of humanity. And it was a battle he thought he might win. That is what was at stake that first Christmas night, as the dragon snuck in to join the ox and the lamb in that stable. And that's not as pretty of a picture as of Christmas as we're used to thinking about. But you guys, when we shrink wrap Christmas into this nice, palatable little package with a tidy bow on top, we miss the magnitude of the moment. We misunderstand all that it meant, not just for our history, but for our futures. You see, Christmas is less about a birth than it is about a battle. The Prince of Peace was born. We talked a couple weeks ago about how this word peace in Hebrew is shalom. And shalom is this concept of holistic health. Nothing is missing and nothing is broken. But the problem is that the Prince of Peace and the Prince of Darkness cannot coexist because shalom and darkness are at odds with one another. So when the angels appeared to the shepherds on that hillside and they declared, "Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace, shalom to those on whom his favor rests," that wasn't just a proclamation, that was a declaration of war. It was a battle cry that God was invading enemy territory. Make no mistake, when that baby's first cry rang out on that Christmas night, it shook the very foundations of hell. It was God declaring that he's the Prince of Peace, not because peace was already there, but because he was invading a shattered space to make peace. Peace on earth, goodwill to men is a war cry. And that has some pretty big implications for us when it comes to the places in our lives that are shattered, where we have anything but peace, where we feel like we're facing dragons that cannot be conquered. And I have three things this morning that I want to help us understand so we walk out of here thinking differently about who we are and what our stories look like this Christmas. And the first one is this: when the enemy reminds you of your past, he's trying to rob you of your future. We read a few minutes ago about this great battle in heaven where the devil got thrown out forever. And John called him the accuser, the one who stands before God and accuses his people day and night. And it's crazy. The name Satan is actually this Hebrew word that means accuser. And if you read through the Old Testament, you'll find multiple times where Satan actually appears before God to accuse God's people. He comes into the throne room and tells God, "Your people are not who you created them to be." And God actually tolerates that repeatedly because there's justice to those accusations. He's right about us. We're jacked up and we're broken and we're sinful and we're awful. And that's just the stuff other people know about. Like our hearts, that's a whole different level of gross and selfish and dark. See, after the death and the resurrection of Jesus, God began to look at us through the lens of the life of Jesus and the righteousness of Jesus. And so John tells us that those accusations were overcome by the blood of the Lamb. Once Jesus was back from the dead, sitting at the right hand of God the Father, Satan showed up and he's like, "I accuse your people." And God looked at us through the lens of his death and resurrection and said, there's no merit to those accusations. There's no justice to those accusations anymore. The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ accomplished it once, for all, and forever be gone. Which means the devil has no future. So the only hope he has, the only mission he has, is to rob you of yours. So the next time you hear the idea that who you are and what you've done and what's been done to you disqualifies you from the love of God, remember who God says you are and how God sees you. Next time you find yourself tempted to believe that the things that once defined you will always define you, that the scars from your past are some sort of dragon that you'll never conquer, remember what Jesus did for you. Every saint has a past, but every sinner has a future because of Jesus. The anchor of our hope is the end of our enemies. Like when Jesus was born, brokenness died. That's the next thing I want us to see, is that brokenness, the brokenness we see all around us in this world, brokenness is not a sign that evil is winning. It is a reminder that evil is losing. John told us that great red dragon is filled with fury because he knows his time is short. It's the 2-minute warning, and he's hopelessly behind. So he's just going to seek, kill, and destroy and take as many people with him as he can before that final gun. And for us, I think that means that the prevailing emotion in our hearts as we look out at a shattered world, as we experience the brokenness of the world, that prevailing emotion ought to be love and not fear or anger. Like, of course the world is broken. Of course people are doing the things that they're doing. Of course they're making those decisions. Of course they're causing us pain. They're being lied to by a liar. Which means, like, no matter how badly they hurt us, we can love them and we can fight for them. And if we need an example of that, where better to look at Christmas time than jolly old St. Nick? Not the portly cookie-eating North Pole one, but the real one. Okay, Nicholas of Myra was a bishop in the 4th century. He's the guy that the legend of Santa Claus was built on. And the emperor of Rome, Domitian, began a great persecution of Christians, and Nicholas got arrested, and he got imprisoned and beaten, and he was tortured. They did some pretty terrible, awful things to him, but eventually they had to release him because he kept on expressing through the middle of all that how much he loved them despite what they were doing to him. And he told them repeatedly that the most they could take from him was his life, but he wasn't too worried about that because he planned to just keep on living more after he died. And the beauty of that story is that we were all created to live like St. Nick. Jesus told his disciples that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. You guys, gates are not offensive weapons. I don't know if you know that, but you don't fling gates. You have never seen a war movie where someone's like, everybody duck, they're shooting the gates at us now. That doesn't happen. So what does it mean that Jesus said the gates won't prevail against his church? It means that the church was built to storm the gates of hell. Like hell's a prison that people all around us are trapped in every day of their lives. We got to look out at everything around us, the violence and the hatred and the racism and the abuse and the oppression and the hunger and the homelessness and all the evil, and realize that stuff doesn't get to win. It is losing. And here at Revision, our mission is to help it lose faster. Like, make no mistake, we're going to kick down the gates of hell and trash the joint. Because the victory is ours. The battle's over. Brokenness is losing. And it's lost. And that kind of changes the way that we fight the fight that's out ahead of us. Life's going to have bumps, plenty of them. And people are going to bruise us pretty deeply along the way. But we got to realize we are not fighting for victory. We are fighting from victory. We don't ever need to sell our hope or our integrity down the river for the chance to maybe win some ground that we think we got to take, because what if it's lost? It's already won. Revelation 12 made it clear. The end is written. It's just the middle we're fighting for now. But we are in a fight. We were born into a world at war, and every one of us who knows Jesus has become a citizen of a rebel kingdom living in enemy-occupied territory. And being born again in Jesus doesn't mean being dropped into a spiritual maternity ward. It means being dropped into the war zone. The birthplace of our faith is much less a womb than it is battlefield earth. And the first words you hear in this kingdom are not, oh, welcome. They're, let's go. We're on a quest to beat back that mighty dragon who holds so many people in our world in bondage. But we can charge forward boldly. Even though life is hard and we got a whole bunch of brokenness and a whole bunch of pain and a whole bunch of scars of our own, we can charge forward boldly because as John tells us in a different letter, 1 John 4:4, greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. Victory is a manger thing. Jesus is setting all things right and all things new. That's how the story ends. That's how your story ends. In beauty and victory, with nothing missing and nothing broken. Look, I don't know what dragons you walked in here facing this morning. Or what struggles you walked in here believing could never be overcome. What battles you felt like you couldn't win. What labels you believed you'd never shed and wounds you figured would never heal. But I want to invite you to do something. This is something I know it's been used and abused in bad ways by many people. There are people who tell you that if you just think positively, you can bend the world toward your will. That's a bunch of garbage. It's not what I'm inviting you to do. But I think sometimes in life, you got to see it before you can see it. So I want to invite you this morning to believe that victory is a manger thing. That because Jesus stepped into the human story, because he died for our sins and rose again, conquering death, the end of the story is written, and the end of the story is shalom. I just want to invite you today to let your soul rest in that knowledge. That even though we don't know the middle, we do know the end. I want you to find peace in the fact that this side or the other, all things will be made right and all things will be made new. This morning, what I want you to do is visualize your victory. I want you to see it before you see it. I want to invite you to realize your dragons have no power. I want to invite you to see yourself according to the things God has spoken over you and accomplished in your world. Like, see your heart made whole. See yourself passionate. See yourself fulfilling your purpose. See yourself tearing down your strongholds. See yourself slaying the dragon. See yourself radically rewriting the future of your messed up marriage. See yourself being set free from the addiction you've been struggling with for too long. See yourself loving the lonely. See yourself setting people free. You got to see it before you can see it. And Christians of all people ought to know that it's possible to see what we can't see because all we see is not all there is. We know the hope of an empty grave. Sometimes you got to see resurrection while you're still hanging on the cross. Sometimes you got to see liberation while you're still in bondage. Sometimes you got to see joy while you're still weeping. The fight is not over, but I'm telling you this morning, the fight is over. And all the dragons of all shapes and sizes that show up in our lives, they have no power because against them we are more than conquerors through him who loved us and won the victory. And I think if we walk out of here knowing that we know that's true, that victory, all things set right, all things made new, nothing missing, nothing broken, if we know that that's the end of the story because Jesus came for us, then we will not only find freedom from the fear and the brokenness that has held us back for too long, but we will be able to bring that freedom to a whole bunch of shattered people in our world, tempest-tossed, beaten by the battle, and desperate to know that there are some manger things like joy and truth and hope and victory that are available to them because of the mega love of Jesus. So let's go bring it to him. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you for winning for us a victory that we could not win. Thank you for slaying the dragon that was too big for us, but he's not too big for you. Thank you that hope is real and joy is real and truth is real and victory is real. Thank you for writing the end of our story. Even though we didn't deserve it, for setting all things right and making all things new. And I pray that you would fill us up this Christmas with the peace of knowing who you are and how you see us. And how unbelievably mega huge your love is. And that you would fill us up this Christmas with the courage to go and bring that to a desperate world living in darkness and dying for your light. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.